Welcome to Decolonising Global Health, the podcast that invites you to learn with us as we explore what decolonisation means for our work in global health. In this podcast, we want to open up the conversation, challenge dominant narratives, and reimagine the future of global health. I'm your host, Cara Munn, and in each episode, I will dive deep into the conversations around decolonising the practices and power structures that shape global health today. The term decolonisation can be defined in many ways. We envisage a process of challenging Western superiority, the reversal of colonial legacies, and recognising pluralistic knowledge systems. Our guests will shed light on why decolonisation is crucial to achieving health equity and offer insights into how we can make it relevant for our audience, many of whom are working in the field of global health from Ireland. Join us as we question, learn and grow together, working towards a world where health is a right, not a privilege, and where every voice is heard and valued. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming two guests who work in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights to the series. Oluwatoyin Chukwudozie, who is Executive Director of Education as a Vaccine, a youth-led organisation in Nigeria, and Fionnuala Murphy, Head of Global Advocacy at Frontline AIDS. Thank you both for sharing your time with us. You're very welcome to the podcast. To begin with, it would be great to hear your perspectives on the topic of decolonising sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I might come to you first, Toyin. For those who are not familiar with your area of work, can you tell us what SRHR is about?
Thanks, Cara, and thanks for having me. So SRHR, Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights, is this big bringing together of so many words that is basically talking about our bodies. Our bodies, especially when it comes to our sexuality and our reproduction. So sexual rights, reproductive rights, sexual health, reproductive health. We know that sexuality it starts, from birth all the way to death. And so what happens throughout our journey of life within this body when it comes to our sexual health, our reproductive health and rights is really what SRHR is about. And while we are here now with, all kinds of angles, perspectives around it, it really is basically about these bodies and, that function and that being a sexual being. Being a sexual person and having all these functions within us and all this needs to be fulfilled as human beings that are not separate from any other functions of our anatomy, our physiology as persons.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And how does this whole field of work interact with the area of decolonisation?
Yeah, I think it would make us to really go back to what exactly colonization had done, the impact, the influence of colonization on different aspects of our society, our practices, our ways of being. Yeah, because before colonization, the pre-colonial era, we were already a people who had our ways of living. We had our ways of solving issues, of solving problems. We had our ways of interacting with one another, relating with one another. However, colonization brought a different way and proposed that the ways in which we had existed was primitive and, even stigmatized and shamed some of our practices and led us to abandoning certain things in the name of moving towards civilization and so on and westernization and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about, our bodies and the ways we had existed and practiced and lived, we find that colonization, of course, like every other aspect of our society, had an impact on our sexuality as people. And when we look at our history and we study history and what has happened, we can see that there's been a shift in the way in which we have practiced, in the way in which we've lived, in the way in which we've defined gender roles, in the way in which we've defined our relationships, that has changed since colonization. We have now taken on these forms of, relating with one another, of being, of interacting with our bodies that has been introduced, by colonialism, and have abandoned the ways, in so many instances, have abandoned the ways in which we have, lived and experienced our bodies. And so it's now the acceptable and the normal to take on what colonialism taught us. So that exactly plays out when you talk about SRHR today, because it is being seen from a lens of what we have now learned, especially within formal education, especially within religion, in politics, in law, which all have relics of colonialism.
Thank you so much for that clarity. I think you've explained it in such a way that it really, really makes sense. I'd like to bring you in here on this, Fionnuala. What does decolonisation mean to you?
Thanks, Cara. Well, as you know, I grew up in the north of Ireland, and that was at a time when people's lives there were still being profoundly shaped by colonisation. And living there, I had very many privileges. I came from a big, loving family. I had excellent education. I lived in a very beautiful place. But when I reflect on how colonisation and colonialism played out in my life and in my family's life, it's still very painful. And for me, what really defined that experience of living under colonisation was of not being able to speak for ourselves and not being able to decide for ourselves. We were Irish, but we were governed by laws that were made in Westminster. Our stories were told by British people working for institutions like the BBC or the Times, and told in ways that really didn't represent my experiences. And just as Toyin has just described, that really stigmatized who we were. And the other defining feature of that time for me was of never really feeling fully safe. Sadly, I had friends and family members who had suffered severe human rights violations and had even been killed at the hands of British state actors and paramilitary groups. So although I was there going about my life, and it was a life that involved joy and togetherness and plans for the future, there was that feeling that you never really knew what was coming next, or if you would be safe. Our safety was defined by others and by the actions of others. And we also knew that if we spoke out or challenged the situation we were in, that would only endanger us further. So for me, when I think about decolonisation, I think about, from my own experience, I think about people being able to decide for themselves and to speak for themselves, and to be able to speak up and be heard as equal voices and as people of equal worth when something is being done to them that is not right. And it's also about safety. And for me, all of those things are critically important to SRHR.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It sounds like quite a painful legacy, and thank you for sharing that with us. Certainly not being able to speak for ourselves and not feeling safe rather are very key aspects of colonialism. Could you tell us, Fionnuala, how do you see colonialism playing out now in your area of work in SRHR?
Well, coming back to those themes from my experience, around who decides and who defines the norms. If you go into a lot of global SRHR spaces today, you will see that these spaces are still very much dominated by people who look like me, people from the global north. And the priorities and the items on the agenda can really tend to reflect that bias. And, to give maybe one example, you will find quite a strong focus on family planning, for example, in those spaces. And family planning is something that we all know is absolutely vital to women's health and their empowerment. But the way that it is approached can become really reductive and quite instrumentalizing. And, there are donor governments whose entire SRHR policy is focused on family planning, and that's talked about as a key pathway towards economic development, but that can really exclude women's other sexual and reproductive health needs, for example. And it can mean that those multifaceted needs don't get addressed in donor-funded programs, and women are really reduced to how many children they have or don't have. And, you know, over many years, certainly I would have seen that playing out in relation to HIV, which remains the leading cause of death for women of reproductive age in Africa and is largely sexually transmitted. It is an SRHR issue, yet it barely, you can go to conferences like the International Conference on Population and Development, and HIV barely appears on the discussions there. And far too often, the voices of women who are living with HIV or young women who are at very high risk of infection will be completely missing from those spaces. And that's a dynamic that is also really reinforced by racist and colonialist immigration policies, which still prevent the people who are most affected by these issues from being in spaces where they're talked about. And then at the same time, right now, we're seeing the backlash on sexual and reproductive health and rights, which I know we're going to talk about more. And, you know, that's a backlash that has largely been driven by a couple of conservative countries in the global north, but it's playing out really profoundly in people's sexual and reproductive health and lives around the world, and it has life and death consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I'm hearing really is this dominance of the global north is not just limiting progress in the area of sexual and reproductive health and rights, but it's actually infringing on the rights of individuals in these countries where they're affected. Can you tell us, Toyin, in Nigeria, who is setting the agenda on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and how can communities set their own agenda?
Thanks, Cara. In terms of who's setting the agenda, I would state, categorically that it is mostly set by the ones who have the resources to invest in that area. Our government has long-term goals for sexual and reproductive health and rights, but it is facilitated by resources. And these resources are coming from bilaterals, they're coming from multilaterals, they're coming from high net worth individuals. And so we cannot take away the fact that while the institutions that are in charge of these areas have those visions, those goals, those objectives, they would still really have to align with the people who have the resources to support their goals and aspirations. And that cannot be achieved without, a lot of influence of, the one who's holding most of the resources over the agenda. So even when you look at the evidence that informs decision making, so the DHS survey and all those other kinds of research that informs evidence that is supposed to help to also set this agenda, it's being also resourced by other people outside our governments, our communities, and so that has a lot of influence on what the direction is, what information is collected, and how that is utilized, to make decisions and to intervene in different ways. In terms of how the communities can set the agenda, I feel like agenda setting, what really gives it legitimacy is community leadership. If the community is leading, and I know that these are words that are used a lot by people, but in reality, we want to see it done like more. We want to see actual leadership of communities in agenda setting. And when you talk about community leadership, what exactly is it? This is not about tokenism. This is really talking about, when communities are the ones who determine what exactly you do when you bring your resources. And so even though the resource is coming from somewhere else, they have to be on the decision-making tables as to where those resources go. That is the only way that the agenda can actually reflect the needs of the communities. So it's not about just, bringing people together and just saying, oh, we have this, we want to do that. It really is about centering community governance beyond, just implementation of ideas. It's about what communities want to see happen and making sure that that is what is done, and having the systems to also check that it has happened exactly the way communities want it to happen. There's need to listen to us, our bodies, our experiences, our realities in deciding whatever has to happen when it comes to SRHR. The example that Fionnuala gave, very perfect. When we talk about family planning as the only thing that is important in terms of SRHR, is that really what communities are saying that they want to see done in their communities? There are other needs that are being overlooked while others are being amplified the more. What we're saying is that while we recognize the importance of all of this, it really has to be led by the voices of the communities. What we say we want to do, what we say we want to see, is what we should be seeing in these agendas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And how do you think partnerships can play a role in empowering communities? So even partnerships, when we're talking about these so-called North-South partnerships, where the northern partner is maybe bringing the finances, can partnerships work for good as well? Can there be situations where they can also support communities to set their own agenda?
Absolutely. Partnerships are key in the agenda setting, especially in this current reality and context. Partnerships is not about pitting the North versus the South. It's not about isolating one over the other. It's really about solidarity. It's about, having a shared vision. It's about equity. And we know that because of the power dynamics that exist between North and South, between who holds the resources and who doesn't, it only would take an intentional move for a partnership to work for communities. It would take a conscious effort. It would take, recognizing diversity, recognizing and respecting our differences, and ensuring, that when we talk about intervening, that this is not about somebody coming to save another person, in the way we have seen it happen so often, but that we understand we are in solidarity with communities who are most affected by these issues. So it really is about having these voices, front and center of the conversations, hand in hand. A good example is, and thankful to be doing this with Fionnuala, is the partnership that exists within the Frontline AIDS, as an institution. It's a partnership that's spread across different continents, and we are all coming together to even define what the agenda for the work that is going to be done, in 5 years, in 10 years, whatever that number is. We are defining it together. We are deciding it together, and we are bringing our realities as communities affected, as communities, as leaders in our communities, as voices in our communities, into such an agenda. And what happens is that when we start to roll out things, it's not alien to us because it's things that we contributed to. And even as we go along the line, we are holding our hands together. We're doing this in solidarity with each other. We have space to voice what is wrong, what is challenging, what the tensions are. We have space to have accountability. We have space to even review our progress together. That sort of partnership is what we want to see more in terms of what we're doing with SRHR and having community voices being at the center. Lastly, representation is also key when you talk about partnerships. So you cannot talk about partnerships without having representation. There has to be a way to show the people. It's not just to show, it really has to be that the people who are also living these experiences are visibly represented in decision-making, in conversation spaces at all levels, from, indigenous level all the way to the global levels. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It sounds refreshing to hear about this partnership. Perhaps, Fionnuala, I could ask you to jump in here on this. From your perspective, why do you think this partnership between Frontline AIDS and or a number of smaller organisations is working so successfully?
Well, I think that at the heart of our partnership model is co-creation. And I don't want to suggest that it's perfect and we've got everything right, because I think that we all have a very long way to go. But we have a global plan of action which has been co-developed with our partners. So it's not a strategy that we set centrally from a secretariat. It's a document that everybody owns. And the global plan of action has 6 priorities. And we work in action teams with partners to define what each of those priorities should look like, and to co-create and co-deliver activities and programs that reflect them. And when I think about one of the programs that we've collaborated with Toyin on, the United for Prevention program, that came out of Action 1 of our global plan. And when we launched Action 1 back in 2020, we worked with partners to really create the strategy for that action from the very beginning. And then when we got to the midpoint, I can remember we had a discussion with partners where we said, if we were lucky enough to get some funding from a donor to really scale up the work that we've been doing in this action, what would it look like? Blue sky thinking, what would a collaboration look like? And that there was no money involved at the time. It was simply, what would we really all love to do together if we could? And we came up with that concept together, and then we fundraised for that. So we fundraised for something proactively that was co-defined by the partners, rather than having to chase donor money and donor priorities and then squeeze partner organisations, and particularly community-led organisations, into those predefined priorities. And so, that's about how we work. But I think for that to really work at a bigger scale, it's also about how the aid sector and the donor sector needs to change, so that, I would love to see a world where there are many more donors who would be interested in hearing from a partnership like ours about something that's being co-created in that way, and that's really being driven by local priorities, and would be willing to say, yes, you're the experts, you've decided this is what's needed, and now we'll fund it, rather than that sort of top down, this is our strategy and we will only fund you if you fit into it. I hope that helps.
That does help. Thank you. I just find it really interesting, and I think it's also a point of reflection for all of us who work as donors as well, to think about how does this compare with the work that we're doing. And the word that stands out to me in what you've said there is co-creation. So there's really equality between the partners in it when you're looking at it from that perspective. Fionnuala, I'd like to look now a little bit at your work in the area of HIV and this growing wave of anti-rights movements that are pushing back both against HIV and SRHR work. Can you tell me a little bit about these movements and how they're affecting the work that you're doing?
Toyin can speak to this in a way that's much more visceral than I can, but you now have an army of anti-rights actors across different countries that are mobilising against the most basic tenets of an effective HIV response. You have groups that are opposing the provision of condoms for young people, saying that by providing condoms will make young people promiscuous, when of course there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that. They are mobilising against the new HIV prevention technologies that could be real game changers in the AIDS response. They are against sex education for young people. Again, they peddle false but very emotive narratives that sex education sexualizes young people and makes them promiscuous, when actually we know that sex education can literally save young people's lives. And rather than making them have more sexual partners, it actually tends to mean that they have sex later. And when they have it in a way that is safe for them and their partners. And these groups are also pushing a very aggressive criminalisation agenda. They're seeking to further criminalise LGBT people in particular, but in some regions you also see that play out more directed towards people who use drugs, for example. So it's a very challenging time for the HIV response. And now, you know, what we've seen happen in the US, where the US government has, you know, massively cut back its funding for HIV almost overnight, is a manifestation of these same anti-rights and anti-gender movements. And, you know, you can see that the US aid freeze and now the cuts have very much taken a focus on we don't want to invest in programs for LGBT people. We don't want work on human rights for these excluded communities, and we don't even want to fund family planning. That's how regressive things are right now. You know, and you can see situations where the US aid has been withdrawn from programs for women who survived rape, for example, or for access to prevention for women. So if you're a woman, you can't access prevention to protect yourself on a US aid funded program now, but you can access it. If you're pregnant, you can access it to prevent onward transmission to your baby, which is very important, but you can't access it in your own right. And this, for me, again, comes back to our earlier discussions about colonisation and about other people deciding what you're worth and what you should have, and deciding that your baby may matter, but you don't. It's a very, very challenging time in the HIV response right now.
It certainly sounds like it from what you've described to us, Fionnuala. Before we jump onto the topic of the funding cuts from the US, I'd really like to hear from you, Toyin, about these anti-rights or opposition movements in Nigeria, and if through your work you have been able to respond to it in any way.
Yeah, thanks. So much like what Fionnuala has described, we're seeing the influence of anti-right actors in our country showing up in many ways. And the most common ways are like distorting narratives. Like for instance, like she's mentioned, around comprehensive sexuality education, around reproductive justice, gender roles, gender norms. And so we're seeing a lot of pushback against sex education or sexuality education, as the case may be. We're seeing a lot of pushback around narratives that are empowering for women and liberating for women. We're seeing a growing, misogyny, even in conversations happening in social media spaces and physical spaces. And what this really is, there's also a lot of pushback against even contraceptive use. So there's narratives, like there's all sorts of narratives around contraceptive use. There's narratives against, women's autonomy to make decisions about their own bodies, about their own reproductive health. This is so much entwined and entangled with religion. So people are pushing this and saying, oh, it's because of religious beliefs and all of that. But we know that this is really being, pushed by an agenda that is anti-rights coming from the West. We also know that they have empowered and funded some groups, small groups, individuals, to continue to push these narratives. And then we're seeing them now with, what is happening across the world, especially recent happenings in the US and all of that. We're seeing more emboldened influence and more emboldened voices, right? For the opposition to rights and opposition to women's health and women's reproductive health and rights happen in our country. And of course, that is creating a lot of fear among people. For example, when you're saying to parents that, comprehensive sexuality education is sexualizing children and all of that, it's creating a lot of fear, doubt, misconceptions. And the work we do is to really challenge those narratives, working on, shifting those perceptions, those negative perceptions, addressing the misconceptions, addressing the falsehood, because there's a lot of falsehood that is laced in what they put out. So we address those falsehoods and really center the experiences of young people in these conversations. Center also the experiences of women, especially young women, in these conversations. We have recently had a campaign. It was a small one. It wasn't that big, where we actually had young people speak, had parents speak. We brought them together to talk about what the experiences have been like growing up, puberty and all of that, experiencing puberty and adolescence, and what supports they have required as young people, and to the parents, what supports they have also required, because we know that parents and adults require support to navigate this phase with their adolescents.
Thank you so much for responding on that. It's quite overwhelming for me to hear all this, because it's very, very disruptive to your programming, these anti-rights movements. And I'm also thinking now, just in the context of the funding cuts from the US, how have those funding cuts further impacted on your area of work in Nigeria?
Thanks. So a very critical part of the work we do is ensuring that information that helps and decision making for young people, for adolescents, is in their hands. Information that we know can save their lives. And this funding cuts definitely has, distorted the programs that have been ongoing around providing such information. Anything that has to do with prevention now is a no. And we know that prevention is absolutely key. And we're seeing that we definitely are going to have a rollback on progress that has been made so far. So a lot of that work on prevention is impacted greatly. A lot of the work on SRH information, SRH education, as well as work that is being done within the policymaking space in partnership with government to address gaps in service delivery, to address the barriers to services for specific populations. So that is we cannot just focus on treatment without looking at all those other aspects. And we know that the impact of these cuts on such programs is really going to have a devastating effect. Already is having such effects. We are finding that young people who have been in treatment, who have been in such programs, are also really unsure, uncertain about what is going on. We know that even recently we've started to see a low risk perception amongst young people. And at this point in time is not when such funding cuts should be happening, because that is definitely going to be on the increase. And the kinds of programs to, ensure that we are working with young people to educate them on risk, educate them on, prevention and all of that, it's not going to be happening as much and at the scale as it has happened in the past. So it really is having a devastating effect. Will have even more devastating effect, in the near future.
It must be so upsetting to see the hard-won gains that you've made moving backwards in your area of work. Fionnuala, just maybe if you could speak to it on a global scale, particularly in areas relating to prevention of HIV and the effects that the cuts are going to have.
I mean, Cara, it is absolutely devastating. And I think one of the hardest moments for me since this situation arose was when my colleague, who had been holding phone calls with each of our partners to understand how they were affected, came back and he presented the overall picture of how the cuts were playing out in our partnership. And I actually cried that day, because the numbers were just so staggering. Just across our partnership, 1.6 million people have lost access to essential HIV services, life and death services, due to these cuts. And, you think about people that you've met through our programs and you wonder about where they are now and are they safe and will they have access to treatment or prevention going forward? And it's just heartbreaking. 27 organisations out of the 60 are directly affected, and also many partners who weren't in receipt of US funds and aren't directly impacted are reporting really severe indirect impacts because key services and supply chains in their countries are disrupted, and that's affecting everybody. You mentioned prevention, and as Toyin has said, prevention has been targeted and will be really severely impacted. And what is devastating is that, we were just on the cusp of getting these new prevention technologies that we have out to people who need them. Things like injectable PrEP, which only needs to be injected every 3 months and massively reduces a person's risk of acquiring HIV. That was a game changer that could finally allow us to get the numbers of people acquiring HIV down. And that's just been completely pulled out from under people, and it's devastating. We also know that services that were for particular populations that are most at risk of HIV, key populations, and also adolescent girls and young women, as Toyin has said, have been really targeted as well. So not only are services being reduced, but the services for the people who need them most are not there anymore. And human rights and advocacy work has also really been targeted. And again, you need that work to remove kind of human rights and legal barriers which stop people accessing treatment. So at a global level, the situation is undeniably bleak. UNAIDS are estimating that we will see an additional 6.3 million people die over the next 4 years because of these cuts, over the period that Trump will be in power. And at the prevention level, they are predicting that an extra 8.7 million people will acquire HIV during this period, which in turn will require treatment. Those people will require treatment for many years to come. So we're really looking at a new AIDS emergency here that can't be understated, and that is the consequence of what has been done and the way that it has been done.
Yeah, it's absolutely shocking, that statistic that you've just told us there. 6.3 million people will die due to these cuts. It's just unfathomable. Obviously, so much of this is tied up with colonial legacies. And I'm wondering, how do we begin to start shifting the power and reimagining a new future? A new future where communities most affected are those that set the agenda, where maybe local sources of funding replace somewhat the funding that may have come from big international donors. Fionnuala, do you have any kind of ideas, or have you been involved in anything where you see that there is a shift or a new ways of looking at how we might move forward in this area of work?
I mean, I'm really keen to hear from Toyin on this, but I think fundamentally it's about who decides and about looking at the structures behind everything that we do to shift the decision-making power and who decides to the people and communities on the front line. And earlier on, I talked about the United for Prevention programme that we implemented with Toyin's organisation, EVA, and several other partners. And at the beginning of that programme, in each of the countries, communities and civil society organisations came together and they took a really deep look at HIV prevention in their countries, and they assessed what was missing and what needed to change and what was going well and where the opportunities were. And having done that, they came forward with their own analysis, which was then published in a set of HIV prevention accountability reports. And it's those communities and those partners that have been using those reports to drive advocacy in their countries and to make the case, whether it's to their governments, it might be to a local health authority, it might be to big donors in their countries, but to make the case for these are our shared priorities as communities on the front line. And, for me, that is a good place to start when you're trying to think about how you can do this work. And for us as Frontline Age, we were able to provide added value around things like the research methodology, but it's very much communities driving and defining the agenda. And I think that is for me, that's the core of moving forward successfully with the decolonisation agenda. It's really about moving as much of the response as we possibly can to where most of the people and communities who are living with HIV can be found. And, whether that's research or advocacy, which I work in, or programme and financial management, it's really all about centering decision-making and priority setting with the people who are most impacted.
Toyin, it would be great to hear from you as to how you see it. How do you see that we can begin to shift power to the communities most affected? And is there anything in your work where you've seen stirrings of a new future in this area?
Absolutely. And thanks, Fionnuala. I think the example you gave is one that is apt. It definitely is about shared power in decision making. It definitely is about centering community governance. The United for Prevention, as you were speaking, I was just reflecting on how the priorities for the program was set within after the kickoff of the program. So it wasn't before the program started that the priorities were decided, and brings me to talking about funding in a different way, because one of the things that program helped us to do was that by the time we had seen those reports and collected all the information, we had the flexibility to decide what we would do. We had the flexibility in resource allocation to decide where the resources were most appropriate for us to, intervene or influence, and so on and so forth. So the flexibility in, resource allocation is an example of shifting power, is an example of how to actually put power back in the hands of community voices, because it's important to provide community actors with such flexible resources so that the need is what is addressed. I think I can also add to that there needs to be feedback mechanisms that help organizations in the North to listen and learn. In ways in which you're not just hearing, but you're also learning from what our communities are saying, from what our organizations, our local actors, indigenous actors are saying. That is absolutely key. Another thing that I feel maybe might not be so prominent in the conversations we have about shifting power is who is having the conversations. Like, I'm here now speaking with Fionnuala. Most times when we have these conversations, it is us who are mostly within advocacy spaces or service delivery and so on. But the people who are within these institutions, who are responsible for managing risk, who are responsible for financial management, who are responsible for upholding the processes and the systems are different most times from us. And so there's also need for internal work to be done within the organizations that currently have a lot more power to bring these other people into the conversation, to be like, we know that this is what our systems look like here, but this is not how it's going to work if we really want to work in partnership with communities to do this work. And there has to be a space within their institutions to consider and actually take forward approaches that gives communities, the power that is supposed to be when it comes to a partnership. And lastly, I would say that there's need to value indigenous knowledge. That is also a way to shift power. We know that Western knowledge is often promoted or prioritized over indigenous knowledge. one way to shift power is to recognize and value our indigenous knowledge in the ways in which we have collected, documented, and shared them through stories, through art, through music, and so on and so forth. It's important that our local knowledge, in the way we have passed it on from one generation to the other, in the way we are currently sharing it with the world, is also valued as much as any research in any big journal. That for me is also shifting power.
Thank you so much, Toyin. You gave us some really practical examples there of how to shift power that I hope will be really useful for our listeners. We're coming to the end of our podcast now, but I would like to hear from each of you if you have any final thoughts or takeaway for our listeners on how we can practice decolonisation in global health. So Fionnuala, if I could come to you first for any final takeaways.
Thanks, Cara. I mean, as I said, I think that it is about moving decision-making and power structures closer to where they need to be with the communities that are most affected. And I really second that comment from Toyin about, that really needs to be at the kind of operational and risk levels of and financial levels of organisations as well. I think as well that right now, because we're in this situation where anti-rights actors are having such a profound impact on people's lives, we need to get really serious about how we're tackling that, and we need to start taking on disinformation. And, Toyin talked about the work that she and her colleagues at EVA are doing on the front line with parents, with young people, with communities, with policymakers to try and counter disinformation. And I think, when you look at some of the narratives that are out there, you can hear something, Toyin can hear something in Nigeria, and from a parent in Nigeria, and I can hear it from a member of my family in Ireland. These narratives are globalized. These anti-SRHR narratives are now globalized, and I think that there's a lot more for us to do in the global north around tackling that disinformation and making it a political priority for our governments, and really clamping down on it, because it is coming from our part of the world and being disseminated very widely. So I think that's critical. Last of all, I wanted to say a word about access to medicines. And, colonialism shows up in lots of different ways in the HIV response. And one of the most profound ways that it has shown up is around intellectual property restrictions, which are international trade rules that are really all about prioritizing the profits, the massive profits of companies in the global north. And at different stages in the HIV response, those restrictions have meant that huge numbers, millions of people have gone without HIV treatment and have died for want of HIV treatment. And right now, those same restrictions are keeping the price of the new HIV prevention technologies extremely high. And particularly now that the US government has pulled substantial amounts of funding out of the HIV response, we really need to stop accepting this as normal. And we really need to start dismantling that entire system and moving towards a system of health justice that means that people can get the benefit of health technologies and health innovation wherever they are in the world. And the people most at risk should be the first in line, not the people at the back of the queue. So for me, that's another big structural issue of colonial legacy that we really need to be tackling. Thanks.
Thanks, Fionnuala. Thank you for that. Toyin, would you like to please give us your final words at the end of this podcast?
Sure. Thanks, Cara. For me, as someone who is from and lives in the global south, my thoughts would be that decolonization for us is about transformation of the mind, a conscious action to undo certain ways, certain practices, ideologies, even including knowledge itself and how we get to know, and very important transformation and a conscious thought about our identity and reclaiming our identity, and celebrating what that identity is, because who we are truly as a people, as African people, is central to decolonization. So, and we need to have more of these conversations. We need to have a lot more conversations where we talk about reclaiming this identity, reclaiming our bodily autonomy. And we know our bodily autonomy is rooted deeply in our lived experiences, in our indigenous understanding of our own bodies. We need to be the ones defining for ourselves what normal is for our bodies, and not, what others have told us that normal is for our bodies. We know that these things are also very deeply connected to actions of institutions, but for me, the work at individual level is the most important, because we make up those institutions. Right here, we are the ones who form, the policy making spaces and so on. So the level of work that needs to be done at our individual thinking when it comes to decolonization is critical. And we need to really reclaim and promote our own systems of knowing and be the ones actually setting our own agendas for SRHR. Those would be my final words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toyin. I think we've moved from Fionnuala's experience of living under colonialism and not being able to speak for ourselves to this positive note of how we can move forward and reclaiming and celebrating our own identity, but that perhaps all of this requires work at the individual level and personal transformation. But it's at least a pathway that we can see from your words, Toyin. So thank you so much. As we conclude this podcast, I just want to thank both of our guests today, Fionnuala and Toyin, for such an insightful and wonderful conversation. And I really hope we have the opportunity for more conversations on this important topic. Fionnuala was a guest speaker at our inaugural IGHNX event in 2023. Her talk was entitled The Rise of the Anti-Rights Movement and Its Impact on Global Health and Humanity. Fionnuala also contributed to a recent webinar as part of the Restore Humanity campaign. This webinar was called Reimagining Global Health and Development in the Wake of AIDS Cuts. Both of these recordings are available on the IGHN website and in the podcast notes. Thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of Decolonising Global Health. We hope you found today's discussion thought-provoking and inspiring. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue these vital conversations. If you are enjoying this series, make sure to listen to our podcast series, Better Health for a Better World, in which we discuss a wide range of global health topics and explore global health projects and initiatives in the Global South. Listen on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Stay connected with us on social media for additional resources and more information about our guests and topics. Together, we can drive the change we wish to see in global health.